it's Dr. Gilchrist giving you your very last lecture for research methods. Now, just to kind of remind you of where we are in the semester, do remember that we were going to be talking about extended designs with one independent variable this week. Although I'm actually recording this on the 25th of November, and you'll be receiving an email about this on November 30th. So greetings from the distant past. So you're going to be watching this the week of November 30th. And then the following week is the week of December 7th. Remember that that is going to be our writing week. So I will not be giving you new lecture material. I will be making myself available during our office hours, which are now on Discord. I will give you information to access that. You're also welcome to email me. So today I did actually grade your results in discussion sections. I can tell you in general I was pretty pleased, but I could definitely notice a couple of common themes that popped up across the 6 different papers that I graded. First of all, y'all need to be checking on your APA formatting, and that includes your tables and your graphs and your citations. Also, in general, every single one of you, for the most part, needs more in the discussion than I saw at the end of the paper. And I get it. So we're trying to replicate something. We did, but we have a small sample size. We have a large confidence interval, so obviously it's not 100% perfect, but you've got to give me more than that. You've got to try, where possible, to go back to your introduction, see the kind of issues that you brought up and that you raised, and then address those in the discussion. So am I asking you for a discussion that's several pages? No, of course not. But I saw cases where the discussion was only a paragraph and had no citations, and I'm like, you got to give me more. And so I was kind of hard in certain aspects, but I think in other aspects I was easier. I went kind of light on most of you with that discussion section, but if I see it again and you haven't made an effort, yeah, the points are getting knocked off a little bit. So I'm happy to help you out. I want you to make this as good as you can. I would also strongly recommend going to the Writing Center. There are people that are available online to help you. So take advantage of those things. Now, with that said, we are now going to move on to talk about our final section. We are going to talk about designs that have one independent variable, and the independent variable has more than 2 levels. So this is not something that we can do a very simple compare one group to the other or compare one condition to the other. We are going to have to look at a few different ways to do this, and for the confidence interval method, it's really not that hard. In the case of doing null hypothesis testing, we are going to introduce something called analysis of variance, but I'm going to keep it really, really brief for you. So, what are we going to be talking about here? I'm going to put, trying to figure out where to put my head. I think it'll go better up here because we have a lot of pictures. So I will occasionally be moving the camera of my head around to different areas just to make that a little bit easier. So here's what we're going to be covering. We're going to talk about the OneWay independent groups design. And when we talk about one way, we mean one independent variable with 2 or more levels. Now, if you only have 2 levels, this is pretty straightforward. You just compare your groups or your conditions. But we're going to talk about what happens when you have more than 2 groups. We are going to talk about comparing and contrasting different means along with confidence intervals, and this is really not going to look all that different from what we've been talking about all semester. We will talk about the difference between planned and exploratory analysis, and when we are talking about multiple levels of independent variables, that is when things start to get more complicated and it becomes more important to engage in a planned analysis. So for most of this, we're largely going to be focusing on our between groups design. So each different condition is represented by a different group, but we will briefly talk about what happens in a repeated measures design. And then finally, we will talk about analysis of variance. And I'm going to be a little bit more charitable toward analysis of variance than your book is. And that's partially because, well, I came up using analysis of variance, and I can see the benefits that it might have for somebody, particularly if they don't really have a lot of experience with confidence intervals, or if they don't have a lot of experience with planned analysis. So I think analysis of variance is actually perfect for people like y'all that are just coming into this. I don't think it's where you should end your work, but I think it's a very easy way to kind of understand different ways that you can examine differences between conditions and groups. Say hello to Earl. He hasn't had a lot of time with me today. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. So we're going to start by talking about the OneWay independent groups design. So part of the reason that you would potentially want to do these kinds of designs is because they can help you save time and money, and they can address questions that a simpler study can't address. So this is something that I actually kind of brought up last semester when we talked about experiments that have an independent variable with multiple levels or multiple independent variables. Variables interact with each other. There are often not simple linear patterns. Sometimes the patterns of results are more complex, and they're not necessarily linear effects, but if you only have two groups, how are you going to connect them? A line. So this can really be beneficial for us. And because most variables tend to have more than two levels, and because these variables interact with each other, I would actually argue that extended designs tend to look more like everyday life than a simple two groups between groups design. So a one-way independent groups design has a single independent variable with three or more levels. So if you just have two levels, you can just do a standard between groups design. But if we have three or more, each group is getting their own condition. So what you're looking at here is data that comes from Bushman in 2005. And so he and colleagues were actually interested in how much attention people actually pay to ads. And so participants had to watch three different types of shows. And he was kind of wondering if the type of show that you watched would end up affecting whether or not that would end up affecting your memory for the advertising content. So participants either watched a show with violent content, sexual content, or neutral content. So an example of violent content would be Cops. I would actually argue Law and Order might have more violent content than something like Cops. I never really see a lot of violence in Cops. I mostly just see people getting arrested. Sexual content, an example would be something like Sex and the City. And then neutral content, the example that your book gives is America's Funniest Home Videos. So, so they're watching these shows, and they, regardless of group, there are 12 different advertisements that are inserted into these shows while people are watching. And then and all the ads are the same. So the only thing that is changing here is the content of the television. And so then participants were given a surprise memory test for the ads. They were basically shown different types of product brands, and they were asked, hey, have you seen this before, or is this new to you? So they did a very, very basic test of brand recognition. Now, here's the data with its own confidence interval, and I hope just by looking at this graph, you get a really intuitive idea of what differences you might end up expecting. So I want you to notice that in general, the recognition performance for people that were presented with neutral content is much higher than those for violent or sexual content. And part of the reason that we know this, And I would argue odds are pretty good that these differences between neutral and violent and neutral and sexual are probably going to be statistically significant because, let's take a look, this is a between groups design, so we can actually take a look at the overlap here. And I want you to notice we've got no overlap between neutral versus violent. We definitely don't have any overlap between violent and sexual. I also want you to note that there does seem to be a significant amount of overlap between violent content and sexual content, so those are probably not that different. So Bushman had actually suspected that participants may recall ads less when they were distracted by sexual content or violent content. Both of those are really attention grabbing. And so would violence change memory performance, for would sexual content affect that performance? So here's the thing that actually makes this kind of analysis really easy. So we've already talked about how to do a between groups comparison in a between groups design. So all we have to do is compare one group to the other. So you don't actually have to do anything super fancy or super complicated to look at these differences. All you have to do is look for differences between pairs of means. So you can do a selected comparison. So Bushman, kind of based on his hunches, would probably want to compare neutral to violent and neutral versus sexual. So we can look at the differences between these two means and then actually relate them to our research questions. So here, you can definitely see that just judging from the fact that there's not a lot of overlap here, showing a violent or a sexual show significantly reduces recognition memory for ads when we compare them to neutral. So here is a general strategy. So let's talk about how we actually figure out what these confidence intervals are and doing these between groups comparisons. So you might remember that when we looked at a between groups design, one of the things that we needed was a pooled standard deviation. So a very general strategy to analyze a one-way independent groups design first, and this is of primary importance. This is a case where, especially when you have a lot of different groups or a lot of different conditions, this is when you need to be planning. Now, if you're doing something like analysis of variance, I would argue you still need to plan, but because of the way that analysis of variance works, you don't have to plan as much. And that can be beneficial in some ways, and it can be detrimental in ways. But if you're doing this kind of comparison using confidence intervals, you need to plan ahead of time a very small, we're talking small, and we'll talk about why small is important here. We need to select a small number of comparisons that correspond with our research questions, such as, does Fluffy Cat on Dr. G's lap make understanding statistics better? I wish it did. I hope it does. So we're going to select a very small number of comparisons. We'll talk about how many comparisons you can reasonably do. You can always do more, but we'll talk about why the more comparisons that you end up doing, the more of a problem it becomes. At that point, you need to focus only on your selected comparisons and then use confidence intervals on the difference to interpret. So this is a preferred approach, and it's pretty straightforward. It just means you're going to have to do a little bit of legwork ahead of time. So you might remember that when we looked at the confidence interval on the difference between two groups back in Chapter 7, we relied on a measure called pooled standard deviation. That is what we need for calculating a margin of error, along with a t-statistic, or a t-statistic at a certain level of confidence and with a certain degree of freedom. So we had the t component, we had our variability component, and we had our sample size component. So when we are doing a design where we're comparing different groups, but there's more than two, our calculation for our pooled standard deviation is going to change a little bit. So you might remember us talking about something like this, and you're like, Dr. Gilchrist, that was 6 chapters ago. That was a long time ago. Yes, it was, but it wasn't that long ago. So our pooled standard deviation, when we have 2 groups, basically looks like this. So we have our standard deviation for the first group. We're going to square that. We multiply it by the number of people in group 1 minus 1, so we're weighting it based on the number of people in each group. We do the same thing with group 2, so we multiply the number of people in group 2 minus 1 multiplied by the standard deviation for group 2 squared. And then we basically take all of that over the number of people in group 1 and the number of people in group 2 minus 2, we get 2 degrees of freedom because we have n minus 1 in each group, and then we take the square root of that. So you might remember that that's how we calculated our pooled standard deviation. What do we do when we have 3 groups? It's really not that different. So basically what we're going to do, and by the way, you can imagine what this would look like with 4 groups, 5 groups, 6 groups, 7 groups, and so on. If you have more than 4, I would say use something like ASCII, because this is going to be a real headache for you. But here's kind of the idea for 3 groups. So we take the number of people in group 1, minus 1, multiply it by the standard deviation, square it. Same for group 2, same for group 3. We add up all the people in each group and subtract 3, because it's n minus 1 degrees of freedom for each group. And then we take the square root. So the pooled standard deviation really hasn't changed that much. It's just that with each group, we have to keep adding to this average. And that is how we basically find our degrees of freedom as well. So group 1 is n minus 1, group 2 is n minus 1, group 3 is n minus 1. So when we put all of that together, we get the total number of people minus 3, or the number of people in group 1, group 2, and group 3 minus 3. Okay, so if we want to calculate the margin of error for the difference between independent means, this is how we do it. So in this case, we are still going to look for a specific t at 95% confidence and a certain degrees of freedom. In this case, that degrees of freedom is going to be n minus 3. Multiply that by our pooled standard deviation, and then we have our sample size component. And so really, so here's what's really critical. So our pooled standard deviation is going to be the same for, and that includes all 3 groups. But when we are looking at the difference between the neutral group and the violent group, we're only looking at 2 groups. So this will not change. So N1 and N2 are going to be the sizes of the 2 groups in our comparison. So you could potentially, those of you that are more mathematically inclined, you could try to work this out on your own. You have all of the data that you need here. So we've got the people in each group from Bushman. We have their mean performance, and we have our standard deviation. So you could plug all of this in and do that right now. But why do that when ASCII can do that for you? So let's go ahead and hop onto ASCII. And so here is the data, and here is all the information that we have from our table. So take a look at this. So already in this instance, we've calculated a margin of error and our bounds for our confidence levels for each of our groups. Additionally, here are our total degrees of freedom because we have 84 people in each group, and then we subtract 3, which leaves us with 149. So I'm going to kind of walk you through this. We're going to do a comparison. So you have to open up the ASCII intro chapters 10 through 16. And make sure that you got your macros enabled. And I'm going to enable editing because it's being, you get back here. Enable content. Make sure you enable your macros. So here's how we're going to do it. So the ESCI figures, here are our summary statistics. Notice that our total N is 252. Here is all of our data. That is nice. But here's what I really kind of want to show you. So here we have our summary statistics. So if we pick table 2, we get statistics above. If we have our full data below, okay. Oh my. So here, okay, maybe we shouldn't have done that. Okay, let's try that again. So in full data below, if you wanted to enter in your own data, and hint, this is what you would potentially want to do with your Hershey stuff. So when we're looking at the difference between Hershey's and Godiva, you could actually enter in the full data right here. We're going to go ahead and go back to statistics above, and it's not working. We got to take that data over. So we're going to click this button. Okay. We go to transfer data. Here is all, oh my, that is different data. So we'll look back at that. I'm going to close this and try this again. This is going to be one of your more interesting lectures. So we'll transfer the data because that's a different study that we're going to talk about. I knew as soon as I pulled it up that that data didn't quite look right. So let's go ahead and pull up our ESCI again. There it is. We're going to try this again, and I'm not editing this out. You need to see all the mistakes. It helps boost that sense of authenticity. All right, so this time I'm not going to touch it. But basically, if you wanted to, and by the way, we're going to go into individual groups comparisons. So if you did want to enter in your full data, you could enter it in right here. So hint for your Chapter 14 handout, this would be a good way to do that. So in this instance, we've already got our summary statistics. So in particular, here's what we need to do. We are going to be comparing our means. So notice here that we can have up to 6 different means, and they've been labeled mean 1, mean 2, and mean 3. So here's our data for our neutral content, our violent content, and our sexual content. So I'm going to do this. We're going to compare our, so you're going to have to click one of these 3 buttons to do the comparison. And then you are going to subtract that from the bottom selection of your choosing to get the confidence interval on the difference. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick neutral minus violent. So notice what happens when I do this. So first of all, we actually get our confidence interval on the difference. And additionally, you can see our effect size. So we have M1 minus M2, so mean of neutral minus the mean of violent. We get a point estimate difference of 1.4 here in the confidence interval on the difference. Notice that our confidence interval on that difference ranges from 0.6 all the way up to 2.1 or 2.2. So what this basically means is that there does seem to be an advantage for neutral content over violent content. Additionally, the margin of error is 7.71, and the p-value clearly indicates in this instance that it would be less than 0.001. So it's very clear that there is a significant difference here, and that there are differences, and that the type of content that you watch does seem to have an effect on your memory performance. So that's really helpful. That's exciting. So now we can do the exact same thing, and we can do that with our sexual content. Notice that the effect is even larger here. So by the way, they've kind of grayed out the second mean so that you pay less attention to it because we're only comparing these two. Notice that there is absolutely no overlap here. And additionally, here's our confidence interval on the difference. Here's a measure of our effect size. It's 2.22. The confidence interval on the difference ranges from 1.45 all the way up to 3. This is a massive difference. And so we can make a pretty good judgment call that neutral versus violent and neutral versus sexual are very, very different from each other. And so this is really, really helpful for us. So I'm going to go ahead and clear our data. No, I'm not going to clear it. I will go back to here. So we're not going to look at anything. So it's kind of clear. Hopefully you got a pretty good idea just from eyeballing this data that they were different from each other. And now we can have it confirmed with these comparisons. And really, this is nothing more than what you've already done. You're just basically not considering that third group. You're planning ahead of time which pairwise comparisons you want. So that's kind of neat. Okay. All right, give me just a minute. I don't know where my recording button went, and it's kind of freaking me out. So I think I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and I will have more about the confidence interval on the difference in the next video.